Maya Bennett, are you sleeping while this company is paying your salary? The words cracked across the control room so sharply that every keyboard stopped clicking. Conversations died mid-sentence. Even the steady hum of the server racks suddenly felt louder than before. Maya's eyes opened slowly as the glow of 6 computer monitors reflected across her tired face. She blinked once, trying to understand where she was. The digital clock on the wall read 5:14 a.m. She had never meant to fall asleep. She had only closed her eyes for what felt like a heartbeat. Standing a few feet away, Edward Whitmore, the white CEO of Apex Dynamics, stared at her with the kind of disappointment that made the entire room hold its breath. His tailored navy suit looked untouched despite the early hour, every crease perfectly pressed, every movement deliberate. He had built a reputation on discipline, precision, and impossible standards. Employees whispered that he could identify a mistake before the software itself detected it. They also knew one more thing. Edward Whitmore never gave second chances. Around the room, engineers quietly lowered their eyes, pretending to study their monitors while secretly watching every second unfold. Nobody dared speak. Nobody dared move. Maya slowly stood from her chair, her muscles stiff after hours that no one else had witnessed. A paper coffee cup sat beside her keyboard, the coffee inside long since gone cold. 3 empty energy drink cans rested beside stacks of handwritten notes filled with calculations, diagrams, and lines of code that stretched across dozens of pages. None of it caught Edward's attention. His eyes saw only one thing: an employee asleep at work. "This company doesn't reward excuses," Edward said, his voice calm enough to be more intimidating than anger itself. "Turn in your badge." A soft gasp escaped somewhere behind the rows of workstations. Maya looked down at the identification card hanging from her neck. The plastic badge had opened every secured door in the building for nearly 5 years. She reached up without hesitation, unclipped it, and placed it carefully into Edward's waiting hand. There was no argument. No desperate explanation. No attempt to defend herself. She simply nodded once. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. Her voice carried no bitterness, only exhaustion. Edward slipped the badge into his jacket pocket. "Human Resources will process the paperwork this morning." Maya picked up her worn backpack from beneath the desk. The shoulder strap showed signs of years of use, just like the sneakers she wore during countless overnight shifts. She glanced one final time at the wall of monitors still displaying streams of green and white system logs racing across black screens. Thousands of lines continued scrolling without interruption. Tiny status indicators blinked steadily. Cooling fans whispered inside the server cabinets lining the glass walls. Everything appeared normal now. Quiet. Stable. Safe. She turned toward the exit, passing coworkers who couldn't bring themselves to meet her eyes. One junior engineer started to say something, then stopped. Another looked down at the floor, guilt written across his face. The automatic doors slid open with a soft mechanical hiss as dawn's pale light spilled through the hallway windows. Maya stepped into the corridor without looking back. The doors closed behind her, leaving only silence inside the control room. Edward folded his arms and surveyed the room. "Let this be a reminder," he said. "Excellence doesn't sleep." No one responded. The silence lingered for several long seconds until a faint alert chimed from one of the unattended workstations. Then another. A young systems analyst frowned at his monitor and leaned closer. His fingers froze above the keyboard as dozens of audit logs began appearing across the screen, each stamped with Maya Bennett's employee ID, each recorded hour after hour throughout the entire night. His heartbeat quickened. He swallowed hard before quietly whispering words that would soon change everything. "Sir, I think you need to see this first." Maya had barely reached the employee parking lot when the cool morning air brushed across her face, carrying the faint scent of rain mixed with fresh asphalt. The first rays of sunrise reflected against the glass tower behind her, painting the headquarters of Apex Dynamics in shades of gold that seemed almost ironic. 5 years of arriving before sunrise and leaving long after sunset had ended with less than 20 words. She tightened the strap of her backpack and kept walking. Inside the control room, the silence no longer felt ordinary. The young systems analyst, Ethan Parker, stared at the audit dashboard as new entries continued populating the screen every few seconds. His eyebrows slowly pulled together. "This cannot be right," he whispered. Another engineer rolled his chair beside him. What is it? Ethan pointed at the timeline. Every critical system patch completed during the previous night carried Maya Bennett's digital authorization. Every emergency override. Every server reroute. Every security verification. The timestamps stretched backward hour after hour until they reached nearly 27 continuous hours. She never left, Ethan murmured. Across the room, Edward Whitmore remained composed, but his attention shifted toward the cluster gathering around the monitor. Problem, he asked. Ethan hesitated before answering. Sir, these logs show Maya was active almost the entire night. Edward walked over without speaking. His polished shoes echoed softly against the raised floor panels. As he approached, additional graphs loaded automatically. Processor loads, database traffic, cooling efficiency, cybersecurity alerts. Every chart showed unusual activity beginning shortly after 2 o'clock the previous morning. None of it had triggered executive notifications because someone had manually stabilized each event before it crossed the emergency threshold. Edward folded his arms tighter. Who authorized these interventions? Ethan swallowed. According to the system, Maya did. A senior infrastructure manager leaned closer. Run the comparison. Within seconds, 2 digital timelines appeared side by side. The first showed the network exactly as employees saw it that morning, calm, balanced, fully operational. The second reconstructed what the infrastructure would have looked like if those corrections had never been made. Red warning indicators flooded across the screen. Regional servers failed one after another. Manufacturing facilities disconnected. Supply chain software stalled. Customer platforms crashed in sequence like falling dominoes. The room became perfectly still. Nobody reached for a keyboard anymore. Nobody even cleared a throat. Edward watched the simulation without blinking. Is this verified? He finally asked. Another engineer nodded carefully. The simulation is generated directly from live system telemetry. Every correction came from her workstation. Ethan opened another window. Hundreds of lines of source code appeared across the display. Thousands of carefully written changes filled the screen. Each modification carried Maya's employee identification, timestamp, and encrypted digital signature. There were no shortcuts, no copied solutions. Every line had been written manually during the night. She rebuilt the recovery logic herself. Ethan said quietly. Nobody assigned this project. Edward's expression remained unreadable, but something behind his eyes shifted almost imperceptibly. He looked toward the empty workstation where Maya had been sitting less than 10 minutes earlier. The cold coffee cup still rested beside the keyboard. Handwritten notes remained scattered across the desk, filled with equations, server maps, and careful observations written in neat blue ink. Nothing about the space suggested carelessness. Everything suggested someone who had refused to stop until the work was finished. Then another notification appeared on the largest monitor. Security archive available. Camera playback automatically synchronized with audit records. Ethan looked toward Edward before placing his hand on the mouse. Sir, he said softly, I think we should watch what really happened last night. The security footage flickered onto the largest screen, and the room filled with the pale glow of recorded midnight. A digital timestamp in the corner quietly began moving backward through the previous evening. At exactly 2:23 in the morning, Maya Bennett appeared alone inside the control room, carrying a fresh notebook, a reusable water bottle, and another cup of coffee. The office around her looked almost deserted. Most workstations were dark. The city skyline beyond the glass walls shimmered beneath scattered clouds while the lights of distant highways stretched across the horizon like ribbons of gold. Edward Whitmore stood motionless with his hands behind his back as every pair of eyes followed the recording. Maya settled into her chair, opened several monitoring dashboards, and immediately noticed something unusual. She leaned closer to the screen. Her fingers paused above the keyboard. Then she reached for a printed network map and compared it against the live system. Ethan quietly pointed toward the monitor. Right there, he whispered. A tiny warning icon flashed for less than 2 seconds before disappearing. Most engineers would never have noticed it. Maya did. She immediately opened another diagnostic window, then another. Within minutes, nearly a dozen complex system dashboards covered her monitors. Processor temperatures, memory allocation, network routing, automated manufacturing controls. Every graph revealed a different piece of the same hidden puzzle. The deeper she searched, the more serious her expression became. She reached for her phone, started dialing someone, then stopped before the call connected. Instead, she closed the phone, took a slow breath, and began typing. Thousands of characters appeared across the terminal window. Minutes became hours. The footage accelerated slightly. Outside, the lights of nearby office buildings disappeared one floor at a time as employees across downtown headed home. Inside Apex Dynamics, Maya remained exactly where she was. Around 4 o'clock, she stretched her aching shoulders before returning immediately to the keyboard. At 6, she walked to the break room, filled her coffee cup, and returned less than 3 minutes later. At 8, the morning staff arrived. Several co-workers greeted her politely before continuing with their own assignments, never realizing she had already been working throughout the entire night. Edward watched silently as the recording continued into the afternoon. Maya skipped lunch. She declined an invitation from another engineer to join the team downstairs. She simply smiled, pointed toward her monitors, and returned to work. Ethan shook his head slowly. She never told anyone there was a problem. The infrastructure manager answered quietly. She probably did not want to cause panic until she understood it. The video advanced into the evening. Shadows lengthened across the control room as the sun disappeared behind the city skyline. Maya rubbed her tired eyes, scribbled another page of calculations, and restarted another cluster of servers. Every successful correction erased another hidden failure before it could spread through the company's network. Finally, just after 5 o'clock the following morning, every warning indicator across her screens turned green at the same time. Maya leaned back for the first time in more than a full day. She smiled faintly, whispered something no microphone could capture, folded her hands on the desk, and closed her eyes. 4 minutes later, Edward had walked through the door. The room fell silent once again as the recording ended. No one spoke. No one needed to. The truth had already spoken for itself. The recording stopped, but no one moved. The only sound inside the control room was the quiet circulation of cool air flowing through the server cabinets. Edward Whitmore continued staring at the frozen image of Maya asleep at her workstation, her hands still resting beside pages of handwritten calculations. Just minutes earlier, he had seen an employee who appeared careless. Now he saw someone who had carried an entire company's future through one exhausting night without asking for recognition. Ethan Parker slowly opened another report that had been generated automatically by the system. "Sir, there is more," he said carefully. Edward turned his attention toward the monitor without speaking. The report summarized every emergency action Maya had completed. She had identified a synchronization fault inside a newly deployed software update that had quietly corrupted data moving between production facilities in Texas, Ohio, and North Carolina. Because the corruption spread so slowly, every automated monitoring program had classified it as normal background traffic. It was almost invisible. Almost. Maya had noticed a tiny inconsistency in the timing of a single data packet and realized something far more dangerous was hiding beneath the surface. The infrastructure manager adjusted his glasses and quietly read the engineering notes attached to Maya's work. She isolated the fault before it reached the manufacturing control systems. Then she wrote a temporary recovery framework from scratch while the network remained live. Another engineer looked genuinely astonished. "One person built all of this?" "Apparently," Ethan answered, without requesting additional resources. Edward leaned closer to the display. The technical diagrams were remarkably organized. Every decision included an explanation. Every modification documented both the risks and the expected outcomes. Maya had even written recommendations for a permanent solution that the engineering department could implement later that week. She had not simply solved the immediate crisis. She had left behind a roadmap to ensure it would never happen again. The realization settled heavily across the room. She had been thinking about the company long after the emergency would have ended. A financial analyst rushed into the control room carrying a tablet. His breathing was steady, but his expression revealed urgency. "Sir, finance completed the preliminary impact assessment." Edward accepted the tablet without saying a word. The estimate filled the screen. If the hidden failure had reached the automated manufacturing network during peak production hours, contracts across multiple states would have been delayed. Customer penalties, emergency recovery costs, equipment downtime, and lost market confidence would have combined into projected damages exceeding $200 million. Edward read the figure twice before lowering the tablet. No one questioned the number. Every department represented in the room had independently verified the calculation. The room remained completely silent until the infrastructure manager quietly asked, "Does human resources know she has already been terminated?" Ethan looked down. The paperwork was submitted less than 20 minutes ago. If no one stops the process, her company access will be permanently disabled. Edward's jaw tightened for the first time that morning. He looked once more toward Maya's empty workstation. The cold coffee, the scattered notes, the chair still pushed back exactly where she had left it. None of those details had seemed important before. Now every one of them told a story he had failed to see. He reached into his jacket pocket, removed Maya's identification badge, and held it in his hand for several quiet seconds before speaking. "Cancel the termination immediately," he said. Then he looked toward Ethan with an expression no one in the room had ever seen on their disciplined chief executive. "And find Maya Bennett before someone else realizes just how valuable she really is." Human Resources answered on the second ring. "The termination request has already entered the system," the director said. "If we do not reverse it within the next few minutes, her company credentials will be permanently deactivated." Edward Whitmore did not hesitate. "Stop the process immediately," he replied. "Nothing else gets approved until I review it personally." Across the control room, employees who had witnessed countless executive decisions exchanged uncertain glances. They had never heard their chief executive interrupt an official dismissal. Ethan Parker was already tracking Maya's company phone, but the screen displayed a simple message: "Device disconnected." He checked the employee parking records. Her access card had opened the exit gate exactly 11 minutes earlier. She was gone. Edward closed his eyes for a brief moment before looking back at the engineering reports covering the conference display. Every page carried the same quiet signature: Maya Bennett. There were no dramatic comments, no complaints about working alone, no requests for recognition. Only detailed observations, careful calculations, and handwritten reminders for the next shift. One note near the bottom of a page caught Ethan's attention: "Verify the cooling sequence again after sunrise. The temporary fix is stable, but stability should never replace certainty." Ethan read the sentence aloud. Nobody responded immediately. The words sounded less like instructions and more like a promise someone had made to strangers she might never meet. The financial analyst stepped closer with updated projections. "Sir, our insurance consultants just confirmed the estimate. If production had stopped during today's scheduled manufacturing cycle, nearly 30 client contracts would have entered automatic penalty clauses. Several long-term partnerships might not have recovered." Edward slowly lowered the tablet. The figure no longer felt like a statistic. It represented thousands of employees, families, suppliers, and customers whose livelihoods had depended on work they never even knew was happening overnight. He looked around the room. How many people reviewed these alerts before Maya found the problem? The infrastructure manager answered quietly. 6 engineers received partial notifications during the previous shift. The system classified the activity as low priority. Everyone assumed the software would correct itself. Edward nodded once, but the answer settled heavily inside him. One person had chosen to question what everyone else accepted. One exhausted engineer had refused to ignore a tiny inconsistency because experience had taught her that major failures often began as almost invisible details. Outside, the morning traffic rolled steadily past the headquarters as sunlight reflected across the glass walls. Inside, the atmosphere had completely changed. The confidence that usually filled the executive floor had been replaced by thoughtful silence. Edward walked slowly toward Maya's workstation. He gently picked up the cold paper coffee cup still resting beside the keyboard. The date and time were written across the side in black marker by the cafe downstairs. 26 hours earlier. He placed the cup back exactly where it had been and carefully straightened one of her notebooks. Tucked inside the final page was a photograph of an older woman smiling on a front porch beside a young Maya, wearing a high school robotics team jacket. On the back, written in faded blue ink, were simple words: "Keep solving problems, even when nobody notices." Edward quietly closed the notebook. For the first time in years, his reflection in the dark monitor looked unfamiliar. Not because he had made a difficult business decision, but because he had judged someone before understanding the full story. He turned toward Ethan with calm determination. Call every airport, train station, and rideshare service if you have to. Contact building security. Speak with reception. I do not care how long it takes. Ethan nodded immediately. Edward looked once more at the empty chair before adding the words that stunned everyone standing nearby. Today, we are not searching for an employee. We are searching for the person who reminded this company what true excellence actually looks like. Maya Bennett sat alone on a wooden bench outside the downtown commuter station, her backpack resting beside her feet as the cool morning breeze carried the scent of fresh coffee from a nearby cafe. Commuters hurried past without noticing the woman quietly watching the city wake up around her. Glass towers reflected the rising sun, buses sighed to a stop, and distant train announcements echoed through the station. Her company identification badge was gone now, leaving only the faint outline of the lanyard against her blouse. She wrapped both hands around a paper cup of hot tea she had purchased with the last few dollars in her wallet. The warmth reached her fingers, but not the heaviness resting in her heart. She replayed the morning again and again, searching for something she could have done differently. Perhaps she should have explained. Perhaps she should have mentioned the emergency. Then she slowly shook her head. The work had mattered more than receiving credit for it. That had always been enough for her. Inside Apex Dynamics, the atmosphere remained unusually quiet. Nobody returned to ordinary conversations. Nobody laughed. Even the familiar sounds of keyboards seemed softer than before. Ethan Parker continued making calls while reception contacted local transportation services, hoping someone had seen Maya after she left the building. Every answer sounded the same. No confirmed location. Edward Whitmore stood alone inside the executive conference room overlooking the city skyline. He rarely entered that room without discussing quarterly profits, expansion strategies, or shareholder expectations. Today, none of those subjects occupied his thoughts. Instead, Maya's notebook rested open in front of him. He slowly turned another page. More calculations. More careful observations. Small reminders written in neat handwriting. Beside one network diagram, she had written a single sentence. People trust systems because someone chooses not to ignore small warnings. Edward read the line twice before quietly closing the notebook. His reflection appeared in the dark window behind him as morning sunlight spread across the city below. For years he had believed leadership meant moving quickly, making decisive judgments, and refusing hesitation. Yet the greatest mistake of his career had taken less than 30 seconds. Not because he lacked intelligence, because he had failed to look beyond the surface. Downstairs, several engineers had gathered around Maya's empty workstation. Without saying much, they carefully organized the scattered papers she had left behind. One engineer placed fresh flowers inside an empty coffee mug. Another quietly replaced the burned-out desk lamp bulb she had never asked anyone to fix. No one had instructed them to do any of it. They simply wanted her workspace to remain exactly as she deserved to find it if she ever returned. Outside the station, Maya glanced toward the skyline one last time before standing. A bus arrived with its doors opening in a soft hiss. She reached into her backpack and pulled out a folded envelope containing several job applications she had printed weeks earlier, never expecting she might need them so soon. She took one slow step toward the bus, unaware that at that exact moment a black company vehicle turned onto the next street. Moving carefully through morning traffic as Edward sat in the back seat, holding her employee badge in one hand and her notebook in the other, hoping he was not already too late to ask for the one thing no executive could ever demand, but only humbly earn, another chance. Maya folded the envelope of job applications and stepped toward the waiting bus just as someone behind her called her name. Maya. The voice carried across the station with a sense of urgency that made several commuters glance over their shoulders. She turned slowly and saw Ethan Parker jogging through the crowd, his tie loose, his breathing uneven after crossing 2 city blocks. Behind him, a black company sedan rolled to a stop at the curb. Edward Whitmore stepped out, still holding her employee badge in one hand and the worn notebook in the other. For a brief moment, no one spoke. The morning traffic continued flowing around them while sunlight reflected across the station windows. Maya looked from Ethan to Edward with quiet surprise, unsure why they had come. Edward walked forward at a measured pace, stopping several feet away. The confidence that usually surrounded him had been replaced by something far less familiar. Humility. He extended her badge toward her with both hands. "This belongs to you," he said softly. Maya looked at the badge but did not reach for it. "I thought human resources already finished the paperwork," she replied. Edward lowered his eyes for a moment before answering. "They almost did. I stopped it." A gentle breeze lifted the edges of the papers inside Maya's envelope. Around them, people continued boarding buses, completely unaware that one quiet conversation carried more weight than any executive meeting held inside the glass tower nearby. Edward held out the notebook next. "I read every page," he admitted. "I watched the security recordings. I reviewed every line of code. I know what happened now." Maya remained silent. There was no satisfaction in her expression, no desire to make him feel guilty. She simply listened. Edward took a slow breath. "You prevented a system failure that would have cost this company more than $200 million. You protected thousands of jobs. You stayed awake for more than a day because you refused to leave a problem unfinished. Then I walked in, saw 4 minutes instead of 27 hours, and judged you without knowing the truth." Ethan quietly stepped back, giving them space. Edward continued, his voice steady but sincere. "I have spent years telling people that leadership requires good judgment. This morning, I failed my own standard." Maya looked toward the skyline before answering. "I understand why you reacted the way you did. From where you were standing, it probably looked exactly as you described." Edward shook his head gently. "No, from where I was standing, I only looked at what was easiest to see. I never asked the question that mattered most." Maya finally met his eyes. "Which question?" Edward answered without hesitation. "Why?" The single word lingered between them. Not defensive, not dramatic, simply honest. Edward extended the badge once more. "I cannot erase what happened this morning, but I can admit I was wrong. I would like you to come back, not because the company needs a talented engineer, but because this company needs the kind of character that kept working when nobody was watching." Maya looked at the badge for several quiet seconds before accepting it gently. She held it in her hand, without placing it around her neck. "Coming back is not the difficult decision," she said softly. "Believing that I will be seen differently tomorrow is." Edward nodded slowly because, for the first time since arriving at the station, he realized that earning forgiveness would take far more than reversing a termination. It would require rebuilding trust one decision at a time. Maya looked down at the employee badge resting quietly in her palm as morning sunlight reflected across its plastic surface. For several long seconds, she said nothing. The noise of buses arriving, commuters greeting one another, and traffic moving through the city faded into the background. Edward Whitmore did not rush her. He understood that some decisions deserved silence before words. Finally, Maya slipped the badge into the front pocket of her backpack instead of placing it around her neck. Edward noticed the gesture immediately, but chose not to mention it. Trust, he realized, would not be restored by a simple apology or a returned badge. It would have to be earned through actions. "Would you be willing to come back with us?" he asked gently. Maya looked toward the towering headquarters of Apex Dynamics, standing several blocks away. "I will come back," she answered calmly. "But not because I need the job." Edward listened carefully. "I will come back because the engineers who stayed beside me deserve to know the work we finished together mattered. They spent months building those systems. I cannot leave them wondering whether everything we protected was forgotten." Ethan smiled quietly. That answer sounded exactly like the Maya everyone inside the engineering department respected. She was never motivated by titles. She cared about the people behind the technology. During the drive back to headquarters, almost no one spoke. The city passed quietly outside the windows while sunlight washed over sidewalks, storefronts, and morning commuters beginning another ordinary workday. Yet inside the company vehicle, nothing about the morning felt ordinary anymore. Edward occasionally glanced toward Maya, who calmly reviewed one of her engineering notebooks as though the previous hour had never happened. There was no resentment in her expression, only the same thoughtful focus that had carried her through 27 exhausting hours of work. When the sedan arrived beneath the headquarters entrance, word had already spread throughout the building. Employees quietly gathered along the main lobby, not because anyone had instructed them to stand there, but because they had learned the truth. As the elevator doors opened on the executive floor, conversations stopped naturally. Engineers, analysts, reception staff, security officers, and department managers all turned toward Maya. Nobody applauded. Nobody cheered. The silence itself carried far more respect than noise ever could. Edward stepped forward and faced everyone. "This morning," he began, "I made a decision before I understood the facts. That mistake belongs to me alone." The room remained completely still. Maya Bennett protected this company from a catastrophic systems failure while the rest of us believed everything was operating normally. She demonstrated extraordinary skill, remarkable discipline, and an unwavering commitment to people she may never even meet. Instead of recognizing that dedication, I judged appearances. Several employees lowered their heads thoughtfully. Edward continued, "Leadership is not about pretending to be right all the time. Leadership is about accepting responsibility when you are wrong." He turned toward Maya. "On behalf of Apex Dynamics, I am sincerely sorry." Maya looked around the room and saw something different from the faces she had passed only hours earlier. The uncertainty had disappeared. In its place stood genuine respect. She smiled softly before answering. "Every engineer eventually learns that the smallest warning can prevent the biggest failure. That lesson applies to people too. We all miss things sometimes. What matters is whether we are willing to see them when the truth finally appears." A quiet warmth settled across the room. In that moment, Maya did not return as someone seeking revenge or recognition. She returned exactly as she had always been, a woman who believed solving problems was more important than proving someone else wrong. And that choice transformed the culture of the company far more deeply than any line of code ever could. Morning sunlight poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Apex Dynamics Control Center, washing the room in a warm golden glow that felt completely different from the cold fluorescent light that had filled it the day before. The same rows of monitors continued displaying streams of data. The same quiet hum of servers echoed through the room. Yet everything had changed. Maya Bennett walked through the automatic doors carrying the same worn backpack she had carried for years. She wore the same practical shoes, the same calm expression, and the same quiet confidence that had never depended on a job title. As she approached her workstation, she slowed to a stop. The old coffee cup was gone. Her scattered notes had been carefully organized into neat folders. The broken desk lamp had been replaced. Fresh white lilies rested beside the keyboard, accompanied by a simple handwritten card signed only with the words, "Thank you for staying when the rest of us did not know we needed you." Maya smiled gently before placing the card inside her notebook. Edward Whitmore stepped into the room without making an announcement. He carried a small polished wooden box, setting it carefully on Maya's desk. Inside rested a new identification badge. Beneath her name appeared a new title, Chief Systems Reliability Engineer. Maya looked at the badge for a long moment before lifting her eyes toward Edward. "This is more than I expected," she said quietly. Edward shook his head with a humble smile. "No, it is still less than you earned." Several engineers standing nearby exchanged warm smiles before returning to their workstations. The room no longer felt divided by positions or titles. It felt united by respect. Over the following weeks, Maya introduced a new engineering review process requiring every employee, regardless of rank, to ask one simple question before dismissing an unusual warning. What if this small detail matters? The phrase quietly spread throughout the company. Meetings became more collaborative. Junior engineers found the confidence to speak. Senior managers learned to listen before reaching conclusions. Small observations that once would have been ignored now received careful attention. Productivity improved. System reliability reached record levels. Yet the greatest improvement could not be measured by reports or financial statements. People began seeing one another before judging one another. Several months later, the company held its annual leadership conference inside the same headquarters where everything had nearly gone so wrong. Edward stood before hundreds of employees and investors. Behind him, a large screen displayed charts showing the strongest operational performance in company history. He could have spent the afternoon discussing profits, market expansion, or technology. Instead, he told a different story. He spoke about the cost of assumptions, the value of humility, and the quiet courage of a woman who refused to stop solving a problem even when nobody was watching. He never described her as the employee he almost lost. He described her as the leader who reminded everyone what leadership truly meant. When the audience rose for a standing ovation, Maya lowered her eyes with quiet gratitude rather than pride. She understood something that could never be programmed into any computer system. Character was built in ordinary moments, not celebrated ones. As the conference ended, she returned to the control room alone for a few peaceful minutes. Outside, the evening sun reflected across the city skyline, while inside the monitors glowed with calm green status lights. She rested one hand lightly against the edge of her desk and took a slow, contented breath. The systems were stable. The people were stronger. The lesson would endure long after every line of code had been replaced. Behind her, Edward paused at the doorway but chose not to interrupt the silence. Some victories did not need applause. They only needed the quiet certainty that justice had finally found its place, proving that true strength is revealed not by power, but by integrity, kindness, and the willingness to see the value in someone before it is almost too late.